I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. I would like to welcome you to today's meeting on Saudi Arabia, The Kingdom Strikes Back, a very provocative, exciting title. I mean, David is always very good at coming up with these ideas, you know. Saudi Arabia has been in the news for forever and ever. I mean, for at least the last 30 years. But recently, with the stand it took, first opposing the idea of Mubarak leaving Egypt, and then also with the whether we could call it invasion of Bahrain or marching into Bahrain, and also the opposition position it has taken vis-a-vis Iran since the Islamic Republic came to power. But then on the other hand, the relations with the United States have been very important, and we saw in recent months a cooling off of those relations. We were very fortunate to have David visiting recently both Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, and what you will be hearing today is really a first-hand account of his trip to Saudi Arabia, his impression, and a serious analysis of where we go from here. David Ottaway is currently a senior scholar at the Wilson Center. A year ago, he wrote a piece for us here called it Egypt at the Tipping Point. And I wish the Egyptian had taken his prophecy seriously. So I'm sort of hesitant to see whether to ask him to write another piece for us, this time on Saudi Arabia, but we'll make sure that the royal family would read his piece. David has been a foreign correspondent, national security and investigative reporter for the Washington Post, and he spent 8 years in Africa, 6 in the Middle East and North Africa, and 2 in ex-Yugoslavia. He's currently working on a book that is taking him back to 6 countries when he lived and covered major stories, including Egypt. We are very fortunate to have him with us, and David, you have the floor. Okay. And just before you start, can I ask you please to close your cell phones, Blackberries, because we have live webcast, and not only is this live webcast picked up in the United States, but also overseas, and we get complaints when people start checking their text messages and so on. I don't know. I'm not at all technical, but it interferes with this gadget. So, David, you have the...
I just turned mine off.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is my 4th trip back to Saudi Arabia since 9/11. I've been going there about every 2 years to see what's going on. In light of what's going on in the Arab world today, of course, there's a lot of interest in, wither Saudi Arabia, and I'm working on a paper looking at where is the tipping point in Saudi Arabia, similar to what I saw anyway in Egypt a year ago, and that will be forthcoming in probably another month or 2. But what I wanted to give you today is my impressions of going back there, what the issues. I was there for 2 weeks, and spent 3 days over in Bahrain, because Bahrain is now part of the Saudi story, very much so. And I called the talk "The Kingdom Strikes Back," and you said, well, who are they striking back against? And there's kind of a trio. They're striking it back against their own pro-reform activists at home, and they're striking back against Iran and the United States abroad. So that's quite a combination of people to take on all at once for the kingdom. I was there from March 18th to April 1. I arrived the day after the king addressed the nation, in which he announced he was what people think will amount to about $100 billion in new spending, dealing with the problems of the middle class and the unemployed. There were no new political reforms announced, and there was a lot of new money for the religious establishment of Saudi Arabia. This, of course, caused a deep disappointment among liberals, pro-reform groups that had hoped to see some new reforms announced. But I also found a kind of new mood in town, if you will. The royal family actually trying to flex its muscle, both at home and abroad. The Saudi royal family is really buckling down and muscling up for a far more intense confrontation with both the pro-democracy movement in the Arab world and at home, and Iran. Regarding Iran, the Saudis now are trying to build a more credible and robust containment posture on the Arab side of the Gulf. They are encouraging an enhanced sense of Saudi nationalism as part of this, and they've also taken on a really virulent anti-Iranian, anti-Persian campaign that is now out in the open. They used to say it privately, now it's just public and part of the discourse. They're now blaming Iran for everything, and part of this new self-assertedness is also to try and give the GCC more muscle. Now, domestically, what's been going on? Since the pro-democracy movement got going in Tunisia and Egypt, there were a number of petitions to the king earlier this year, at least 5, although some people told me as many as 15, because now you can kind of gin up these petitions on Facebook or whatever means of communication you want. And so there are a lot, probably more than 5, but anyway, there were at least 5, asking the king to move towards a constitutional democracy, elections for the Shura, separation of the government from the royal family, all that, going in that general direction. Now this provoked quite a reaction from the Saudi government, and the focal point was the day of March 11, that some of the reformers declared the day of rage in Saudi Arabia. 17,000 people at least signed up on the two Facebook sites, in support of the day of rage. 17,000. I saw one figure that said 37,000, but I'm giving you the lower figure. On March 11, one protester showed up. One in Riyadh. Now, I'm impressed that nobody showed up, but I'm also impressed by how nervous the government became in face of this challenge on March 11. But for the moment, the kingdom sits, and you think of the eye of the storm, with a hurricane of pro-democracy groups rising up in Bahrain to the east and Yemen to the west, and there they sit with pretty calm there right now. But the royal family has definitely battened down the hatches and has gained a new confidence that it can weather this storm of democracy across the Arab world. If you look at it from their point of view, this is not the first time they've been really seriously challenged. When Nasser came to power in 1952, he tried to export his Arab socialist revolution to Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis had to put up with this incredible challenge from Egypt in the 50s and early 60s. Then they had to deal with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which involved Iran sending pilgrims to Mecca and really causing a lot of trouble, and there were a lot of deaths. But they weathered it. They got control of it. They kept the Iranians from achieving any of their goals in Saudi Arabia in the 80s. And then they've had the Al-Qaeda challenge since the mid-2000s, which involved gun battles and fighting of the streets of Riyadh and Jeddah, and real struggle. And they weathered it and overcame it. So they have a certain self-confidence now that they can deal with the pro-democracy movement facing them now. And in each case, in order to strengthen its position, the Saudi government has always turned to the religious establishment to strengthen its position. And that's exactly what we see today. Now, what were the reasons for the March 11th no-show? Which, by the way, I think was as much a shock to the government as it was to the people trying to organize it. There are a number of factors. I think King Abdullah is truly popular. And if you look around the Arab world, it's hard to find an Arab leader that you would really call popular among his own people. But the king really is. I think that even the reformers feel he's tried to bring about some reform and against and within his own, against the wishes of a good part of his own family. They've appreciated what he's done. They know how old he is. He, has just come back from 3 months in the United States in a back operation. And they know what's coming after him. And from the reformers' point of view, it doesn't look good. You have Crown Prince Sultan, who's ailing and certainly not considered a reformer, and behind him Prince Nayef, the interior minister, who is the tough cop who's beaten down everybody who tried to push reform. And after him, Salman, who's the governor, and this is the probable succession everybody's talking about now. Prince Salman, who's been governor of Riyadh for, I think, 50 years, and has not known as being a reformer. So from the reformers' point of view, it's pretty grim what's coming next. And so that even enhances the value to them and the appreciation to them of King Abdullah. Secondly, the government made it absolutely clear that anybody who protests was going to be put in jail. And this certainly was a consideration for a lot of people about whether they wanted to go to jail, because it's fine to fight the battle in cyberspace, but are you ready to go to jail in the street after protesting in the streets? Saudis aren't there yet. Thirdly, they got the religious establishment, the highest religious authorities in the country, to issue a fatwa saying that protests were un-Islamic and should not be done. Now, when you start mobilizing the religious establishment like this in Saudi Arabia, in a society that's very conservative, that counts for something, for everybody. And so you had the government, the religious establishment against them, and then you had a problem with the whole March 11 campaign, because even the liberals were not sure who was calling for it and who was behind it. The government was saying, this is Shia put up to it by the Iranians. But a lot of the protesters discovered that the one who was trying to capitalize on it was one of the Islamic opposition leaders sitting in London and calling for people to come out. And the liberals didn't want to help either the Iranians, if that was true, or the Islamic fundamentalists, if that was true. So they didn't have their heart in it. So that was another factor behind it. And then I found there's something very interesting taking place in Saudi Arabia, and people started talking to me about the Libya model. You know, it's one thing, there's the Egyptian model in people's minds now, and there's the Libya model. And for the liberals, the Egyptian model is fine, that's where they want to go. But the Libya model means civil war, the division of a country, you know, stalemate between rebels and the government. And this is really affecting a lot of Saudis who don't want, fear that this could happen in Saudi Arabia and don't want it to happen. So the Libya model has strengthened the government's hand in its argument against protests and causing the same kind, going down that road. So what happened March 11? There was one guy showed up. I talked to my journalist friends who covered the March 11th protest in Riyadh. One guy shows up, Khalid, his name was, screaming and shouting, and you had this incredible situation where some of the journalists, they were in one street in Riyadh, but some of the journalists wanted to go see whether anything was going on elsewhere. So the government arranged a bus to take the journalists around to show that there were no protests taking place in other parts of the city. I've never seen the Saudis do this before, you know, but they were so determined to show nothing was happening. They took whoever wanted to go around the rest of the city to see no protests were taking place, and there were none. But there were a lot of police and helicopters and you know, a lot of color but no substance. So, who's protesting today? I was down in the eastern province. The Shiites are protesting, and almost every Friday now there's some coming out. They're either protesting in favor of the Shia in Bahrain, or over demanding the release of prisoners, Shia prisoners who have been held in jail, some for like 12, 15 years without any trials. They're trying to get this issue of prisoners into a national issue, but it's very difficult, which I'll deal with in my paper later. But they're the only ones really protesting now. So internally, I would say the country, there's a lot, the society is changing, but you can call the country maybe simmering, but nowhere's near boiling. And the government has $450 billion in reserves to throw at problems, the housing problem, take the pressure off the middle class, all different ways, through loans, through and unemployed, paying people who don't have jobs. I mean, they have a lot of money to throw around. But my feeling is that the kingdom is way behind Egypt or Tunis in developing the kinds of forces and institutions you're going to need to see anything happen there. In foreign policy, the kingdom, in conjunction with its allies in the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, there's 6 of them altogether, they're taking a much more assertive role. The Saudis feel Egypt is not going to play a major role in the Arab world in the next few years because it's going to be so bogged down with its internal issues, trying to create a democracy there, dealing with its economic problems, that it's not going to be playing a major role, and that the GCC individually and as a group have an opening to assert themselves in Arab foreign policies. Now you begin to see this in the current situation with a decision of the GCC to take the lead in asking for a no-fly zone over Libya. I found this really extraordinary. They were way ahead of the Arab League and asking for it, and they really pushed the Arab League into taking the same position. But I have never seen the GCC as a group like that really stepping up and saying this should be done. I mean, this is a degree of assertiveness by the GCC it's a whole different magnitude of willingness to take a risky position from their point of view. Another sign, the GCC, pushed by Saudi Arabia, wants to see the Yemeni president out of there. They're now trying to organize a meeting in Riyadh, which would basically see Ali Saleh disappear. And for the Saudis and the GCC to take a position like that on a neighboring country is also extraordinary. This is a new activism that we haven't seen on the part of the GCC or the Saudis. A third sign of this new muscling up. The Saudis are buying $60 billion of U.S. arms over the next decade. This is a huge amount. This is the biggest foreign military sales by the U.S. government, and certainly the biggest by the Saudis of American arms. But what I heard in Saudi Arabia this time, I heard talk that they're going to beef up their military forces. They've already adding 60,000 people to the internal security force, but they're talking of doubling their army from about 75 to 150,000. And there's even talk about conscription. This is just talk now, but the Army is kind of the weakest part of their whole military establishment. So if they really it might help solve the unemployment problem among that youth group that looking for jobs. But so we'll see whether they're going to do this or not. I don't think it's impossible. I don't know how they're going to build an army. The army is really not a very impressive operation, as we saw in Yemen. But anyway, they're talking about it, and it's just sort of a sign of the times. Finally, I want to talk about U.S.-Saudi relations in Bahrain. There really has been, relatively speaking, quite a falling out between the king and Barack Obama and the Saudis and the Obama administration in the last, since what happened in Egypt and the U.S. abandonment of Mubarak, U.S. not even being willing to allow him to continue until the elections this fall when Mubarak was stepping down anyway. This really hit a sore point, and the Saudis are never quite sure what the U.S. is going to do in their relationship to them. There's a fundamental uncertainty about the U.S. and its intentions. And watching Obama abandon Mubarak just brings back a lot of bad memories in their relationship with the United States and uncertainties about what we'll do, which, by the way, go all the way back to the 1973 oil boycott, when Kissinger threatened to invade Saudi Arabia to secure the oil fields. So, there's some, you feel you may say they're paranoid, but there's actually some evidence that give them reason to be paranoid in their relationship, or thinking about the United States. And then you have to remember the Saudis have never forgiven and forgotten that we handed over Iraq to a pro-Iranian Shiite government. There had never been a Shiite government in Baghdad since maybe, there's some argument about whether it was even a Shiite government, but back, 1,000 years ago. We changed the basic balance of power against them. We're supposed to be their allies, right? This is Saudi thinking. And here we have changed the balance of power in the Gulf in favor of Iran. And this is also going on in their thinking about Bahrain. We disagreed about whether Iran was really behind what was going on in Bahrain. Both the Bahrainis and the Saudis were convinced that this was instigated and inspired by Iran. The Americans kept saying, no, Iran isn't responsible for it. So we had different agreements about, a serious disagreement about what was causing it in the first place. Any case, the Saudis were absolutely determined that they were not going to have and will not have a pro-Iranian Shiite government in Bahrain. And this is the first time in Saudi foreign policy speak that they're talking about red lines. Saudi's diplomacy, they tend to prefer to remain very fluid because alliances and friends and enemies change all the time in the Middle East. Perfect example is the relationship between Syria and the kingdom, which sometimes the king and the Assads hate each other, and sometimes they're allies, and it changes each year. But anyway, they like fluidity, and they don't like hardened lines. They don't like to establish lines. First time I've ever heard them talk about red lines is over Bahrain. And this is openly to anybody who wants to talk to them about Bahrain. So this is a kind of assertiveness in their foreign policy thinking that is new to me. It's not that they didn't think that they had to stand up to Iran. They just never publicly articulated it the way they are now. So you had this wonderful climax to the U.S.-Saudi misunderstanding confrontation in Bahrain between March 12th and March 15th. So here's what, I'm going to give you the sequence because it's really kind of fascinating. March 12th, the Secretary of Defense Gates is in Manama, and he calls on the government to take more than baby steps towards reform. Well, the one royal who's interested in reform, the Crown Prince Salman, in fact came out the next day announcing 7 principles for opening a dialogue with the opposition, which called for greater powers for the Bahraini parliament, more Shia representation, addressing most of the issues that they wanted to talk about. March 14th, you have the beginning of Saudi troops, armored personnel tanks, and carriers coming across the 16-mile causeway between the eastern province and Bahrain, which I took on this trip. They're coming across and Jeffrey Feltman, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, is arriving same day, working feverishly to get talks going between the government and the opposition to avert and avoid exactly what's taking place while he's there, the arrival of the Saudi troops. So Feldman goes and he gets an agreement from the main Shiite moderate opposition group called Wifaq, whose leaders we talked to and got their side of the story while we were there. And he gets them to agree, yes, let's go into talks immediately. And he's talking to them on the 14th and then the 15th. The 15th, he's talking to them and he gets their agreement in the afternoon. And Feldman cannot get the Bahraini government to answer the phone to arrange a meeting to see them to get the negotiations going. So right in those 2 to 3 days, you see this confrontation between what the U.S. is trying to do and what the Saudis are trying to do, together with the hardliners in the Bahraini royal family. Feldman warns Wifaq and the others that they got to get out of the circle where they've been camped for maybe 3 or 4 weeks by then, called Pearl Roundabout, Pearl Square. And he leaves that night, mission unaccomplished. The next morning, the Bahrainis move in and just forcefully remove everybody from Pearl Square. And they've now even taken down the monument there, which is supposed to be a monument to the history of pearl fishing in Bahrain. Flattened over the piazza, the square there. I don't know what they're gonna do with it, but you could just see bulldozers getting rid of it, the monument there. And to this day, the Bahraini government is refusing to open talks with the opposition, and perhaps some of you read the New York Times article today about what's going on in Bahrain, but it is really grim. The government is going after anybody who had anything to do with those demonstrations. We saw it when we were there because most of the taxi cab drivers are Shia, and when you want to go to some of the Shia villages on the outskirts of Manama, you're almost certainly to be in a cab with a Shia. But it turned out we had a Sunni. And they stopped him as we were going into one of the main throughways that takes you to the Shia villages, and insulted this guy. I mean, I won't repeat it, but it really, a really ugly insult to him. And the guy said, "No, I'm not Shia, I'm Sunni." And then the guy apologized. Said, "I'm sorry, we didn't realize, we thought you were Shia." When I went, we learned from our Sunni taxi cab driver, I did on the way to the airport, that there's now a blacklist of taxi cab drivers, which is, they take it from their license plates, that any that were seen at the square where the protests were taking place, they cannot go pick up passengers at the airport. I mean, it's really petty. They're going after the medical people who helped the wounded from the square. I mean, it's really ugly. So, what's ahead in U.S.-Saudi relations? I think there's going to be a lot of wear and tear and difficulties ahead, and I'll give you some examples. The Saudis are supporting Assad in Syria. They've come out in support of him. And you know this because they came out with a statement saying we're in favor of security and stability in Syria. You know exactly what that means. We're in favor of Assad and his crackdown. The Americans, of course, are slowly moving in the other direction to, expressions of outrage, quote unquote, about what's going on there in the crackdown in Syria. So I think Syria is going to become another point of contention between us, or could. But it's not all bleak, because I see the United States and the GCC and Saudi Arabia pretty much together in Yemen. Everybody now wants to get rid of Saleh, and we're both going to have to cope with the fallout from that. Saudis in the first place, but it's going to affect our, campaign against Al-Qaeda, et cetera. So we have quite a bit of common interest there. We have common interest in Lebanon because we're both trying to stop the rise of Hezbollah, the Shiite group there, the main Shiite group there. And we're both supporting Saad Hariri. So we have some common interest there. And we have now this huge arms deal that's going to keep us together militarily for decades if it goes through, and so far it is going through. And we have our common enemy in Iran, or a nuclear-armed Iran, or the potential for a nuclear-armed Iran. And that's, in the long term, I think, going to help hold us together too. And finally, we're both fighting Al-Qaeda, and there's incredibly close cooperation between the Saudis and the American intelligence service and chasing down Al-Qaeda people wherever they are. So you have this kind of, on the one hand, these things pulling us apart, and on the other hand, these things keeping us together. And I just see a very tense and difficult relationship moving forward, and how we cope with these conflicts we have over Bahrain, over Syria, over how we deal with Iran.
Thank you very much, David. We'll open the floor to your questions and comments, please. Yes, please. Just, can I ask you to wait for the Mike, please. Just one. Please.
David, thanks for your remarks. One of the things that interested me was one region, one country, or two countries that you left out totally were Israel and the Palestinians, and it was noticeable. As the Saudi foreign policy becomes more assertive, what changes, if any, do you expect to see here? Are they concerned, or is it just not on their radar scope now?
Yeah, the Saudis have always insisted that solving the Palestinian problem is kind of the bedrock of relieving the pressure on everybody, Arabs and Israelis. They keep pushing the Americans to do something. They want the Americans to come out with their own peace plans, a proposal for a peace plan, and force the parties together. They haven't been talking a lot about it because nothing's going on. And I think if Obama does come out with some kind of statement about what he thinks, they will rally to it. But from their point of view, there's so many things going on now in their immediate neighborhood between Bahrain and Yemen that the Palestinian issue is kind of secondary, if not tertiary, in their concerns. That's what I'd say about that.
Yes, please, here. Sure.
Good morning, David.
Morning.
You mentioned two models that the Saudis are referring to as to their future development. One being the Egyptian model, which the United States has found fairly acceptable. Apparently, we've been behind that one, and the Libyan model, which no one wants them to see. What you didn't mention is Kemalism and that kind of Turkish model, which clearly the United States would be very favorable to in the long run. None of these models, though, seem to be available to the Saudis because they don't have an institution that would support them, in particular the army. So are they talking at all about a Turkish model, which would be in our interest?
No. There are some talking about the Omani model, because Qaboos has come out to try to get ahead of the protests there and really talking about reinforcing the parliament's role. Everybody's looking for what's going on in all these monarchies is the transition towards a constitutional democracy of some kind. It's happening in Kuwait, it's happening in Morocco, it's happening in Oman. This is the struggle. It's happening in Bahrain. I mean, what is a constitutional Arab monarchy going to look like? How much power will the king and the royal have? How much will the parliament? So the models are more in the making. Turkey is not a model for them at this point. I don't think it's, and there's also this competition between the Saudis and the Turks, because the Saudis want to assert their leadership in the Arab world, and so do the Turks. And I saw Erdogan give a speech at the Jeddah Economic Forum while I was in Saudi Arabia. And, you know, there was kind of light applause for him, but this guy's clearly not, Turkey's not a hero to them. So I don't think the Turkish model is what they're looking at.
Roberto.
Well, David, when you were talking about Saudi policy towards Iran, you used the word containment. Now, containment is not rollback, and containment is not military attack. Recently, also in some WikiLeaks documents, what we hear is a more bellicose approach of the Saudis asking the Americans to go after Iran not in a containment mode, but in something else.
Yeah.
Do you think that is, in order to get effective containment, they pretend that they're asking for attack or something like that?
I don't think they're thinking about attack right now. I think when they think about containment, they've got to get control of Iranian subversive attempts inside their own countries. That's the first thing of containment. They've got to be sure that they can control their Shia populations, or that they can control Iranian attempts to use their Shia populations or a part of their Shia populations against them. And you know, this battle is taking place. You see it in Bahrain now, because now there's some trial now of two so-called Iranian agents that they've caught, and one Bahraini. They're purging Lebanese Shia that they think were involved in stoking the fires in Bahrain. So the Kuwaitis have arrested a number of what they call Iranian spy ring inside the country. So they're kind of getting control of their own country, and that's part of for their containment. So they're sure that they even control their own countries against Iranian subversion. There was a point when Israel was talking about attacking Iran, where the Saudis and the Bahrainis, and I think even the UAE, you know, more power to the Americans, not the Israelis, but the Americans if they do it. I think they have so much on their plate right now that, you know, attacking Iran is secondary. They first got to get control of their own internal security situations, and that's the first step of containment. And that's what they're working on now. And overzealously, you know, I mean, you really see it in Bahrain, where they're just going back after, you know, clearly elements that want nothing to do with Iran among the Shia, but that's another issue. But so containment right now, they're just trying to get control of their own countries.
Henry? I have everybody's name down, you know, we'll move from sort of.
It seems that the Saudis are pretty much status quo when it comes to the Arab world, with two exceptions, Yemen and Libya. And Gaddafi was awfully rude to the Saudis, so that's understandable. They wouldn't like him very much. But why have they turned against Saleh? And what do they expect to get if he goes? I don't understand their thinking on that.
Henry, I think what's happened, for a while they stayed with him. I think in the Saudi mind, what really bothers them is countries that are failed become failed. They're worried about, they're supporting Assad because they don't want to see Syria fall apart. They don't want more chaos and confusion and, you know, mayhem on their borders or near their borders. They look at Yemen. For a while they stayed with him, and then I think they've decided, I don't know exactly when, but like maybe 2 weeks ago, that this guy was no longer part of the solution. He was not only part of the problem, he was making the problem worse, because Yemen's beginning to fritter away. I mean, the south, there are parts of the south under Al-Qaeda and the Houthi in the north, and you know, they're going to be left, the Saudis are going to be left to deal with this mess. And I think they've decided he's got to go as fast as possible before things even get worse in Yemen, for them as well as for the Yemenis. That's why I think there was a change.
Yes, please. Can we have the mic here? Sure.
David used the phrase tipping point at one point, and then went on to conclude that they weren't at that juncture yet.
Turn your mic on.
It is on. You need to speak a bit louder, I think.
If they're not at the tipping point now, and you made a review of the lineup in the succession, do you see a point in the succession series when they arrive at the tipping point?
Well, you know, one of the things that I think is most worrisome is that the tipping point in the royal family doesn't come for another decade. So you're going to have the senior sons of King Abdulaziz, the founder of the kingdom, still in power for another decade while you have all this. Saudi society has changed. The pressure for reform used to come from the top. The royal family would go ahead and do it, whether the society wanted it or not. The whole thing is flipping. The pressure now is from below. And it's working its way up. And you have, really rather an aged leadership coping with these new pressures coming up. And it bothers me. We got 10 years more to go of the senior sons of Abdulaziz, and I don't see the tipping point there for 10 years. Maybe they'll all die earlier than normal, but what's happening? They're living longer and longer.
Okay, there in the back, please. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Howard Wiarda from the Wilson Center. David, there's a body of literature that suggests that in the long run, all these quasi-feudal Gulf sheikdoms are doomed. And there's another body of literature which goes back to your undergraduate days from some of your mentors, which suggests that once a society is sufficiently middle class and literate and urban and has a high per capita income, and my recollection is that Saudi Arabia is about in the $25,000 to $30,000 per person range. It becomes stabilized and quasi-immune to revolutions from either left or right. I wonder if you would come down on either side of those arguments, or if you'd wish to.
I think one of the problems facing the Saudi Arabia and the Saudi leadership is pressures on the middle class. That right now, in the rising middle class, or the would-be rising middle class, that has a lot of concrete problems facing it. So that this rising middle class is really being squeezed and is discontent and is, I think of the 80 to 90,000 graduates out of the Saudi universities today, more than 40% cannot find jobs in the 20 to 24 age bracket. These are people that should be becoming part of what you would hope would be a stabilizing middle class. But these people are, in fact, really discontent because they can't get the loans, they can't get the land, the jobs are paying in the private sector are worse than in the public sector. The whole economy is really screwed up in terms of taking care of, absorbing, dealing with this kind of rising middle class. So right now, I would say they're a factor for discontent and not stability in the Saudi system.
John, please.
With Hala's permission, two very quick questions, Mr. Ottaway. One, do you see enhanced trade relations with China as a possible Saudi hedge against perceived long-term weakness in the U.S. economy? And secondly, do you see any tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, given the role of Al Jazeera in fomenting regional protest movements? Thank you.
China's big in their thinking in terms of their economic trade relations, but they can't see quite a Chinese ship coming to protect the oil lanes of the Gulf. But they know the Americans will send ships. So the relationship with China has to do with oil sales and economics. And I think they have tried to push it into politics in the sense of getting the Chinese to take less oil from Iran so Iran will suffer, that sort of thing. The Chinese don't really play very good ball in all this. So, yes, China is on their horizon. Qatar, the other question of Qatar. Yeah, there are tensions with Qatar over this, but, you know, the Saudis pushed for the no-fly zone. And the Qataris, okay, they've sent one plane or two planes that's just flying around and it's not doing any attack missions. But, you know, symbolically they're there and they stuck their neck out. And so you almost have to take it country by country and issue by issue about whether the Qataris and the Saudis are on the same wavelength or competing, I think.
Don? No, Don first, and then in the back. Yes, please.
Thank you. Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. David, I thought that was very helpful report. Appreciate it. At the outset, when you were talking about your title, The Kingdom Strikes Back, you indicated they're striking back, yes, at the protesters within and the U.S. and Iran abroad, I believe. But you ended on a very optimistic note as far as our relationships, notwithstanding their objections to our supporting some of these uprisings. Where are they tangibly striking back other than just vocal protests against our policies? I think it was in the paper last week that they were maybe threatening to take their oil somewhere else and sell it and so on, but I don't really see that going through.
David, can we take one more question from, yes, in the back? And then we move, we'll get to
thank you.
everybody.
President Bush and Condoleezza Rice were really pushing Benazir Bhutto to move in and joint govern with Musharraf. I know there was a lot of tension at that time with the Saudis because they had Sharif in exile. What is the Saudis doing inside of Pakistan right now of interest to us? I know they are a major player there.
Well, they've been providing money to the there are two things going on. I mean, they just, you know, the Saudis just want to see a stable. Saudis really think stability and security is top of their list, and obviously Pakistan provides neither. However, the Saudis have a very close military relationship with the Pakistanis, and I discovered in Bahrain, which is kind of part of the whole, that they are now recruiting, I heard 20,000 Pakistanis to come into the Bahraini military. So far I heard they had rounded up 1,000 Pakistanis to come to Bahraini's aid, but you know, I was wondering, are some of those going to end up in Saudi Arabia rather than in Bahrain? Which may be this thing about doubling the size of the military and getting a stronger, much larger army is. So I haven't seen the Saudis do anything other than provide money for the budgetary support for the Pakistanis. So there's some investment and that sort of stuff, the investments. But the security link is quite important. Don, you were saying about U.S.-Saudi, where do you see the friction?
Yeah,
The oil sales have been going down. The Saudis have been switching. They're down about a third. They used to ship here about 1.5 million barrels a day. It's now down to about 1 million. And their oil interests are going east, not coming our way. I don't think they're going to cut off oil. I just don't think it's going to happen. First of all, you know, the Saudis own 2 refineries, 3 refineries in the United States, and something like, I have to get my book to remember, 40,000 gas stations. So in order to even meet the demands for their refineries and their gas stations inside the United States, they need something like 800,000 barrels a day. So it's almost the entire amount they're sending that's for their own interest here in the United States. So I just don't think they're going to cut that off. Where will we see the frictions? I was saying Syria. I think we're headed for, we have different views of Syria and whether or not to support Assad. Bahrain, we're going to keep pushing for some kind of political process. And I think the Saudis are not in favor of that. Generally speaking, they've always opposed our promotion of democracy in the Arab world. It happened under Bush. It's happening under this administration. It's kind of a constant. And now you've got, proto or would-be democratic systems emerging in several countries, and how they're going to deal with that, I don't think they know, but I can see us in conflict. So I can see us in conflict about whether, I think the Saudis will look and support some strong person in Egypt, somebody, the military candidate in the forthcoming presidential elections. And we may be on the other side of this, depending on who that person is. So I can see a lot of different points where we're going to come into conflict.
So they're pushing back,
Um,
it's not really striking back.
I'm going to take three last questions, one to the left, one in the middle, and one to the side. Yes, please. Yes. Gentleman who is busy writing. Here. Yes, you had a question. Yes, and then one in the middle, and then one in the back, and the side.
Thank you. I'm just curious, has there been any consideration of the reforms that King Abdullah II of Jordan had studied, come up with plans for? They finally got voted down in 2008, but King Abdullah in Jordan was looking for a way to institute a constitutional monarchy in that country, and it seemed like he'd done that in an orderly fashion rather than ad hoc. And so I'm just curious whether or not the Saudis have considered that at all.
Then in the middle, please. Yes.
You talked about the Saudis having lots of money to throw at a problem.
Yeah.
450 billion, I think, was the figure you mentioned. Does that suggest that they really don't seem to have priorities that will ensure stability, but are simply subsidizing or buying off protest? And would that not imply that they have to increase rather than decrease oil production?
In the back, there was a, yes, here.
Mr. Ottaway, thank you very much for your presentation. Do you think, given that this is an existential threat to the kingdom, that perhaps we have misjudged and that we have some responsibility for the problems we face? And I just would question, do you have any criticism leveled towards the way in which we've handled especially Egypt and Libya?
Jordan reforms, and what's striking to me is that the Saudis could make a number of reforms to take the pressure off themselves from outside, from the U.S. It's kind of like what Abdullah was thinking about doing in Jordan, but couldn't get enough support from within his own hierarchy and core group. The Saudis can start by having provincial elections. They have municipal elections, and they're going to have another. They're going to have another round in September, but these have not produced much because the municipalities don't have any authority really. They could start by giving the municipal councils more authority, and I got an earful of that from the head of the municipal council in Qatif and their problems of really doing anything, and even though they're all for elections there. They could start with, electing a third of the Shura. There's no elections for the Shura, the National, Consultative Assembly. They're all appointed. They could start with just, electing a third or a half or some symbolic number. They could give women the right to vote locally. I mean, there's a whole series of steps they could take. that are far from turning them into a constitutional monarchy, that they haven't been able to take, and this goes in, there's a deadlock in the family on a lot of this, so they haven't been able to build enough of a consensus within the royal family to take any of these steps. And they want to appease the religious establishment that doesn't want these reforms, so they're not taking place. What was the second question again?
About oil production
Oil
subsidies.
production subsidies.
Continue to restrict oil production or increase it in order to.
Well, they have a capacity of producing 12.5 million barrels a day, and they're up to 9, so they still have a sizable excess, and they have on the boards to go up to 15 million barrels a day. Now, whether they can do it, I don't know, but I think they can go to 12.5, and they're producing 9, so they still have a big margin to fill there.
The basic question is whether they're just going to throw money at problems.
No, I think they're throwing money at problems that are middle-class problems and unemployment problems, which is where they should be throwing it. They should have started like 10 years ago. But I don't think it's just, there's a method in their madness, and they know what they have to, the problems they have to solve. They've just been slow in doing it, and now they're trying to do it. So I don't think they're wasting their money at all. It's just they're very slow and way behind the curve in addressing these middle class and unemployment problems. Third one was misguided in how we handled. That's really a long. I mean, our problem is, my feeling is we are, as a government, whether it's Republican or Democrat, we are profoundly ambiguous about whether we really want to promote democracy in the Arab world, and we always have been. It's so much easier to deal with a strong man, and there are so many unknown unknowns, not to mention known unknowns. When you get into democracies, how is the new government emerging from Egypt going to deal with Israel? Nobody knows, but we know the pressures that are going to come from the street to change that relationship. I mean, and on and on and on. So when it comes to Saudi Arabia, I think there's a time to push and a time not to push. Given what Saudi Arabia is facing to the east and the west and north, I mean, Iraq's still a mess. And for them, they're not even allowing Maliki, the prime minister, to come into the country. They got real problems with Iraq. Given what's going on around them, maybe this is not the best time to push for democracy in that country, or do it privately, encourage them to hold elections for the shura, or the steps I mentioned. Do it privately rather than publicly. That would be my reaction to your question.
Just a quick note before we conclude this meeting. We are having the Bahraini Minister of Finance speaking here on the 19th. And I think this is the first time since the uprising demonstrations that we have an Bahraini high official visiting Washington. And so please, there is a notice outside if you want to take. And please join me in thanking David for a superb